A single signature, one whispered conversation, and suddenly Camilla's entire bloodline was barred from the gates of the palace. But this wasn't just a personal vendetta. This was a calculated strike by the future queen against a hidden power Camilla thought she controlled forever. It began with whispers soft, cautious, but persistent. Within the palace walls, among the polished floors and velvet silence, murmurs spread like fire in silk. "There's been a private order," someone said. "An unsigned directive floating through the queen's inner circle," said another. "Nothing official, nothing concrete. Just faint signals enough to rattle those who understood the weight of such secrets in the House of Windsor. And yet, something felt different this time. Something final. Insiders began noticing odd movements, subtle but deliberate. Meetings were being held after dusk in closed drawing rooms, where Catherine, usually so visible, so poised for the cameras, slipped through doors flanked by longtime royal advisors. These were not ceremonial briefings. They weren't about ribbon cuttings or press appearances. These were legal consultations, held behind layers of silence. When one of Queen Elizabeth's former policy aides was spotted exiting Kensington late into the night, the whispers grew louder. No one knew what was being drafted, but something irreversible was in motion. Then came the first visible crack. Portraits of Camilla's family once displayed along the lesser-known halls near the green drawing room began disappearing without explanation. Officially, it was labeled a routine rotation. But to those who lived behind those walls, nothing was ever routine. Not in that wing. Not when every frame was curated to preserve history and status. Staff members began exchanging nervous glances. Has Catherine already begun wiping the slate? The shift in power had been subtle but undeniable. With King Charles's declining health growing harder to conceal, Catherine had stepped into the vacuum not with noise, but with quiet precision. As Princess of Wales, her influence had grown beyond ceremonial. She was no longer the supportive consort-in-waiting, she was emerging as a sovereign force. One whose decisions were beginning to reshape not just public appearances, but royal infrastructure. It was around this time that the legal team tied closely to the late Queen's protocol office received a draft. Marked, "For eyes only." The document bore no coat of arms, no official seal. But its intent was crystal clear. It outlined permanent restrictions on who could and could not access specific areas of the royal estate. Names were missing, but the implication wasn't. Behind it all stood Catherine, alone. William, insiders say, remained unaware of the final draft. He had been kept at bay deliberately, not out of malice, but necessity. Because for the first time, this wasn't a joint decision. It was hers, a line drawn in ink, not sand. But what could drive Catherine to take such an irreversible step, and why now, with the entire monarchy watching? Behind every royal scandal lies a spark. For Catherine, that spark was lit when Camilla's relatives began crossing boundaries. No Windsor had ever tolerated hosting secret gatherings, using royal privileges for personal gain, and even meddling in private affairs of the Wales family. The initial offense came not from Camilla herself, but from her son. Tom Parker Bowles, never one to shy away from expressing himself, was overheard making dismissive remarks about Catherine's parenting choices during a private dinner. What was meant to remain within the walls of an elite dining room quickly spilled beyond, thanks to an indiscreet guest with connections to the media. His insinuations that Catherine was performative, too concerned with public perception, and overly controlling with her children landed like a bombshell inside the palace. For Catherine, it wasn't the insult that stung, but the entitlement behind it. She had worked tirelessly to preserve the monarchy's image in a post-Diana world, only to be undermined by someone who held no official position, yet felt empowered to judge. And that was just the beginning. Camilla's sister, Annabelle, had been quietly granted limited access to certain royal properties as a courtesy. But she pushed the line too far when she hosted a lavish charity event at one of the minor royal estates, without clearance, without informing security, and without even so much as notifying the Wallaces. It wasn't just a breach of etiquette, it was a flagrant abuse of privilege. Guests posted images online, champagne flowed through corridors that once hosted monarchs. And Catherine, blindsided, was left to answer questions from senior advisors about protocol breakdowns she never authorized. Then came the security breach. Camilla's grandson, driven more by mischief than malice, was caught by palace guards using restricted corridors, pathways used only by immediate royals and security during official movements. The incident was quietly handled, swept under the royal rug like so many others. But within the palace walls, patience was thinning. This wasn't about isolated incidents anymore. It was a pattern. A family, emboldened by proximity to the crown, acting as if they had inherited the institution rather than been welcomed into it. Catherine, ever composed, didn't lash out publicly. Instead, she approached King Charles privately. What was said behind closed doors remains unknown. But sources close to the palace confirmed she raised concerns not only about recent incidents, but about the growing belief that Camilla's family had become untouchable. Charles, frail and fatigued, reportedly asked for time to consider the matter. But time was a luxury Catherine no longer believed they could afford. The royal staff, especially those who had served the late queen, began expressing open frustration. This is not what she would have allowed, one longtime attendant whispered to another after a particularly tense interaction involving Camilla's relatives. Even Princess Anne, usually silent in family squabbles, spoke up. She cautioned Catherine during a walk around the palace gardens, gently reminding her that tradition must be protected not just in name, but in conduct. Her words weren't just support, they were permission. Catherine understood then that the monarchy was not simply a lineage, it was a fortress. And Camilla's family had begun leaving cracks in its foundation. Words had failed. Warnings had been ignored. The time for subtlety had passed. But as tensions simmered behind smiles, Catherine began drafting a strategy far more permanent than words. It wasn't in the public eye. It wasn't even in the light. Under the cover of dusk, Catherine summoned two of Queen Elizabeth's most trusted aides, and that's when the palace's balance of power shifted forever. By the time the doors to the late Queen's drawing room closed that evening, something had already changed. This wasn't a casual conversation or a ceremonial gesture, it was a move decades in the making. Catherine, measured and steady, entered not as a consort, but as a woman with intent that would reshape the future of the monarchy. For those present, the silence between words spoke louder than the words themselves. And then came the signal of the Queen's sapphire brooch. Catherine wore it not out of nostalgia, but as a declaration. This was not rebellion. This was continuity. She was invoking the memory of the monarch who had once held everything together, and she was doing it to justify what came next. The aides, both handpicked by Elizabeth herself, arrived with cautious respect, uncertain of the true purpose behind the meeting. But when Catherine laid the old leather file on the table, there were no more doubts. Within its creased pages lay something extraordinary, a draft buried in Elizabeth's legacy notes. It had never been activated, never signed, but its content was unmistakable. A framework for removing individuals from royal estates who posed a risk to dignity, order, or the long-standing protocols of the crown. It had been created during a time of inter-family turbulence, and although it bore no names, the spirit of it was unmistakably rooted in royal survival. Catherine didn't need to explain. She simply asked, what would Her Majesty have done had she lived to see this? The answer came from the elder aide, voice low and grave. She would have acted while the crown was distracted. That was the moment the weight of destiny settled on Catherine's shoulders, not as a burden, but as a weapon. With Charles increasingly isolated due to his health, and Camilla preoccupied on a foreign engagement tour, the window was open. And Catherine knew it wouldn't stay open for long. Timing, as always in monarchy, was everything. Camilla's absence wasn't accidental, it was a calculated void. Catherine waited until the queen consort had departed the country. No eyes. No resistance. Just enough time to finalize what had to be done. Within hours, the original draft was rewritten, refined, and adapted for modern legality. It wasn't just a list of rules. It was a formal royal decree, steeped in tradition, cloaked in discretion, and ready to be sealed. The aides, while hesitant, could not deny its legitimacy. Catherine was no longer asking for opinions. She was commanding cooperation. When the final page was signed, the monarchy took a sharp turn, and only a handful of people knew it had happened. Catherine had just drawn an invisible line across palace grounds, one that would sever bloodlines and redefine boundaries. Her authority wasn't whispered anymore. It had been stamped, protected by the ghost of a queen who had always valued silence as strategy. As ink met paper, a royal storm quietly gathered, one that would explode when Camilla finally found out. He was next in line, but she didn't tell him. For the first time in their marriage, Catherine took a path that didn't include William, and when he found out, the future king didn't speak for 2 whole days. It was a discovery that never should have happened, at least not that way. William's senior aide had been reviewing internal palace logistics when he stumbled upon a curious folder tucked into the back of a secure drawer labeled Protocol D. Inside was the royal decree, signed, dated, and fully enacted. His hands reportedly trembled as he realized the implications. Catherine had not only gone ahead with an irreversible decision, she had done so without informing the one man the world believed she confided in unconditionally. The folder was delivered straight to William, and when he opened it, the silence that followed inside Clarence's house was said to be deafening. The fallout was swift. William, blindsided and humiliated, withdrew into himself. For 2 days, he canceled engagements, skipped briefings, and spoke to no one, not even his private secretary. Those close to the couple said his silence wasn't rooted in rage but in disbelief. Catherine had made a decision that would affect the legacy of the crown, and she had done it alone. For a man raised to understand that every move within the monarchy must be calculated and shared, this was betrayal. Quiet, surgical, and, worst of all, deliberate. Catherine, on her end, didn't deny it. She gathered her inner circle and addressed what had happened. Her words were calm but revealing, "This was never meant to divide us. This was about protecting what will one day be his." And yet, the damage had been done. When the confrontation between them finally came, it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was painful. William asked only one question: "Why didn't you trust me enough to be part of it?" Catherine's answer was equally restrained, but it cut deeper than expected. "Because if you had known, you might have stopped me." She wasn't wrong. William's nature was diplomatic, bound by duty and public perception. Catherine knew that. She also knew this wasn't a moment that called for compromise. It called for conviction. And so, she chose legacy over consensus. She defended her actions with a simple truth: "I did this for the monarchy, not against you." And in that moment, the lines between loyalty to each other and loyalty to the crown became painfully blurred. Behind palace walls, rumors swirled. Staff whispered in corridors, "Is the House of Windsor splitting at the top?" Advisors debated whether Catherine's move had weakened the unity of the future king and queen, or revealed the strength of a consort finally stepping out from behind her husband's shadow. Either way, the impact was undeniable. The foundation of their marriage, once seen as unshakable, had been tested not by scandal but by strategy. But even as William and Catherine reconciled behind closed doors, Camilla's reaction would prove far more volcanic. They say Camilla's scream could be heard through the marble walls. The moment she read her family's banishment in black ink, the queen consort shattered not just emotionally, but politically. The document arrived not with ceremony, but with quiet deliberation. A discreet envelope placed beside her teacup during a routine afternoon pause, its contents folded with chilling precision. What Camilla expected to be a minor update from her advisors turned into a declaration of war. There, in formal language and sealed authority, was the royal decree signed by Catherine herself, stripping every member of Camilla's family of the right to enter palace grounds, effective immediately. There were no negotiations, no warnings, no recourse. In an instant, years of carefully cultivated power and influence disintegrated. Reports from within the East Wing say porcelain shattered against a marble hearth as Camilla hurled her teacup in a rage. A mirror was broken, perhaps symbolic, perhaps spontaneous, but the message was clear. The queen consort had just lost more than face. She had lost control. Servants said she stormed from room to room, shaking with disbelief and screaming, "She's undone everything I built." These weren't the cries of a woman blindsided by politics. They were the cries of a woman who had seen her dynasty disassembled in a single stroke of ink. Within the hour, Camilla demanded an emergency audience with King Charles. Her fury was matched only by her desperation. She needed reassurance, reversal, and restoration. Anything to prove she was still more than a decorative title. But Charles, already weakened by illness and the burdens of a crown he never expected to feel so heavy, offered no such reprieve. Witnesses close to the king described a man torn between love and legacy. His words, when they came, were slow and weary. She did what had to be done. For Camilla, it was the final betrayal. Not only had her stepdaughter-in-law acted without restraint, but her own husband had chosen not to stop her. Fueled by disbelief, Camilla turned to her personal aides. She ordered them to intercept the rollout, to block any publication or mention of the decree in the royal bulletin. But by then, it was too late. The leak had already begun to seep into media circles. Journalists had caught wind of the friction. Palace insiders were murmuring. The press office, caught off guard, scrambled to regain control. But the narrative had already escaped the palace gates. The world would soon know what had happened. Camilla, once the architect of quiet influence, now stood alone in a wing that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb for her ambitions. She had underestimated Catherine's resolve. She had overplayed her own hand, and now the consequences had found her. Not in court or on camera, but in her most private hour of assumed security. As Camilla's fury burned within the palace, the world outside began asking questions Catherine wasn't ready to answer yet. What was meant to stay sealed in marble corridors suddenly spilled onto headlines worldwide. A trusted aide leaked the document, and within hours, Buckingham Palace was facing its biggest public relations crisis since Diana. It began with a quiet betrayal. A senior aide, known for decades of loyalty, passed a digital copy of the royal decree to a foreign tabloid under the guise of anonymity. No one saw it coming. No one was prepared. The document that had been crafted in shadows, whispered over velvet-draped tables and signed behind closed doors, was now splashed across the internet for the entire world to consume. The headline was damning. Catherine bans Camilla's bloodline royal war erupts behind the gates. And in that moment, the illusion of silence shattered. Social media ignited like a fuse struck by fire. Within minutes, the hashtag Catherine vs Camilla was trending in 20 countries. Users took sides with a ferocity unmatched in modern royal history. Some praised Catherine's decisive leadership, hailing her as the monarch the world had been waiting for. Others condemned the act as a cold, calculated humiliation designed to publicly strip Camilla of all familial dignity. There was no middle ground. There was only war. Outside the palace gates, the digital outrage spilled into reality. Protesters gathered in waves, waving signs and chanting slogans. One camp cheered Catherine as the true heir to Elizabeth's legacy, while the other held portraits of Camilla, accusing the future queen of cruelty and division. Security scrambled to maintain control, but the optics were disastrous images of shouting crowds and police barriers encircling a family meant to symbolize unity and grace. Inside the palace, panic reigned. The press secretary, blindsided and cornered, rushed to release a statement. It was a weak defense, a clumsy attempt to frame the decree as a routine protocol clarification. But the public wasn't buying it. The language was too polished, too vague. The damage had already been done. What was once an internal monarchy strategy had become a global talking point, debated across breakfast tables and newsrooms alike. Camilla's family, sensing the shift, began quietly speaking to sympathetic reporters. A niece shared a cryptic Instagram post about losing access to childhood memories. A cousin gave an off-the-record quote to a London paper, hinting that some things were never meant to be Catherine's to decide. The media frenzy ballooned, feeding on each new whisper, every fresh contradiction. And Catherine? She vanished from public view. No speeches, no statements, no interviews. But silence doesn't always mean surrender. Days later, an image emerged not by accident, but by design. Catherine stood beside Princess Anne, flanked by a wrought iron gate behind them. Locked, cold, impenetrable. It wasn't just a photo, it was a message. One that spoke louder than any press release ever could. With public tensions mounting, Charles had to choose sides, and the side he picked would shatter the monarchy's inner circle. His voice trembled, but the message was firm. In a quiet but final move, King Charles stunned Camilla when he refused to reverse the ban. For the first time, he placed monarchy above marriage. The moment had arrived that no sovereign should ever have to make. A private meeting was arranged, away from cameras, reporters, and even the watchful eyes of senior aides, just Charles and Catherine. 2 generations, 2 visions of monarchy. According to sources close to the situation, Charles listened more than he spoke. Catherine laid out everything: her rationale, the precedent, the breaches, and above all, the need to protect the integrity of an institution that had survived wars, divorces, and scandals. Her tone wasn't cold. It was composed, calculated, and deeply grounded in legacy. And when she was done, Charles reportedly paused for a long while before giving his answer: "I approve," with a heavy heart. It wasn't a royal endorsement made with joy, but it was an endorsement nonetheless. In that moment, Charles signaled what many had long suspected: his reign was transitional, but Catherine's was transformative. Later that evening, when Camilla confronted him for the decision she believed would be overturned, she found a man no longer willing to compromise. He didn't raise his voice, nor did he offer her comfort. Instead, he uttered 7 words that marked the death of illusion: "We cannot repeat history again. Not now." That sentence echoed through the palace. To Camilla, it was a betrayal. To the staff, it was a reckoning. The ghost of Diana, the chaos of the past, the monarchy's near collapse during the 90s all hung over the room like a verdict that could no longer be ignored. Charles wasn't choosing Catherine over Camilla. He was choosing the crown over everything, even love. The decision not to override the decree had implications beyond domestic tension. It confirmed what insiders had begun to whisper. Catherine's influence had moved beyond moral presence. She was now shaping royal law. And with that came a shift in hierarchy, unofficial, but undeniable. Camilla, sensing this shift, withdrew from public duties. She retreated to Ray Mill House, her private sanctuary, refusing appearances, declining interviews, and leaving royal obligations to quietly wither in her absence. Royal historians would later refer to this moment as Catherine's cold coronation. No throne, no crown, no ceremony, but total authority. It wasn't about public perception anymore. It was about institutional gravity. Catherine had tilted the monarchy on its axis, and there was no going back. Inside the palace, advisors scrambled to adjust. A confidential memo was drafted, outlining the need to revise protocol across all royal residences. No longer would family by extension be treated with equal access or leniency. Zones were being redrawn, rules rewritten, engagements reevaluated. The age of blurred lines was ending, and Catherine was the one holding the pen. And while Camilla faded from the halls she once ruled, Catherine was preparing for one final act that would seal the legacy she fought to protect. Buried at the bottom of the decree, beneath the legal jargon and ceremonial stamps, was one final clause, a clause that is not only banned but erased. Camilla's family was not just barred. Their names were removed from the official royal directory forever. It was a discovery that stunned even the most seasoned members of the royal household. While most focused on the ban itself, the prohibition of Camilla's bloodline from stepping foot on palace grounds, the real shock came in the closing paragraphs. Tucked beneath formal language and subtle legal footnotes, the clause read with chilling finality: Camilla's direct descendants and family, by blood or legal association, shall bear no role, right, nor representation within palace grounds in perpetuity. The phrase, "in perpetuity," wasn't just symbolic, it was a sentence, a generational exile, not a suspension of privileges, a deletion from the royal record. The magnitude of the move became clear within hours. Behind the scenes, the royal family's internal digital directory, a system used to manage protocols, access clearances, and seating at state functions, underwent a quiet update. The names of Camilla's children, grandchildren, and immediate relatives were stripped out without announcement or explanation. Keycards were deactivated. Portraits in private corridors were placed into storage. For the first time since Camilla entered the royal sphere, her family was no longer recognized in the institution's most sacred structure, its hierarchy. Even more startling were the subtle but pointed retractions that followed. Invitations to upcoming state events, already issued months in advance, were quietly pulled back. Names disappeared from RSVP logs. Custom seating arrangements were revised. And those within the royal circle, staffers, diplomats, extended family, began to whisper what few dared say aloud: that Catherine had not simply enforced boundaries. She had redrawn the royal map. Some were appalled, others stood in awe. But nearly everyone agreed this was not the move of a passive consort. This was the act of someone who understood power at its most intimate and terrifying levels. The quiet gasps in drawing rooms turned into measured affirmations. Princess Anne, never one to speak in hyperbole, reportedly told a group of aides, "This is how a true queen commands." It was both praise and prophecy. And then came the final gesture, symbolic, silent, and impossible to ignore. The key to the East Garden Gate, once shared among a few select royal family members, was handed over to Catherine in private. That key, according to tradition, signified unrestricted access to the oldest part of the palace grounds, the one place reserved for legacy, reflection, and lineage. It was a closing statement with no press release, no cameras, and no denial of what it truly meant. Catherine had completed her quiet revolution. But the question still lingered across every corridor of power. Was this truly Catherine's last move, or just the beginning of something far greater? She wasn't born into royalty, but she just rewrote its future. As the dust settled and the monarchy reshaped itself around her silent decree, one truth became undeniable. Catherine wasn't waiting for the crown. She was already wearing it. What began as a quiet power move behind palace walls erupted into a national reckoning, and the public took notice. In the weeks following the decree, public sentiment shifted with astonishing force. Polling numbers surged in Catherine's favor, not by a few points, but by margins unseen in recent royal memory. Headlines across the globe declared her not only as the future of the monarchy, but as its saving grace. For a generation hungry for stability and integrity, she became the symbol of both. And while some criticized her methods as cold, the overwhelming reaction was clear. This was leadership the country could believe in. Even William, once blindsided by her actions, began to show signs of quiet solidarity. He didn't issue statements or take part in interviews. He didn't need to. Instead, he stood beside Catherine and their daughter, Charlotte, outside Kensington Palace on a crisp morning, waving to a crowd that had gathered without invitation. There was no speech, no grand announcement, but in that moment, 3 generations standing as one, the message was unmistakable. The future was already here, and it belonged to Catherine. Meanwhile, Camilla's family faded from the narrative with eerie swiftness. One by one, they vacated royal-held properties in the countryside, escorted not by scandal, but by silence. No official announcements were made, no photographers allowed. The palace had orchestrated a quiet exit for a branch of the family once destined to grow in prominence. Now, they were shadows retreating from a stage that had never truly been theirs. And Catherine? She didn't gloat. She didn't retaliate. She simply moved forward with precision. Beyond the UK, global leaders watched closely. From Paris to Washington, diplomatic insiders praised what they termed a firm but graceful reshaping of royal authority. Ambassadors remarked on her composure. World media hailed her as the woman who had redefined monarchy without fanfare, without scandal, and without needing a formal coronation. The comparisons began to roll in. Not to Diana, not even to Elizabeth II in her twilight years, but to Queen Elizabeth I. I am bold, uncompromising, and determined to protect her realm, no matter the personal cost. And then came the image that would echo across history books. Catherine, standing at the balcony of Buckingham Palace not as a spectator, not as a supportive wife, but as the silent architect of a royal recalibration. She wasn't adorned in jewels, there was no speech, but her presence said everything. She had crossed the threshold from consort to commander, and the world stood still to watch. And as the gates closed behind Camilla's lineage, the world opened its eyes to the woman who had quietly taken the throne without a single crown on her head. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.